This week, California is on the Jewish radar ever since an article from Tablet magazine alleged that a state history curriculum in development is rotten to the core with anti-Semitism. Problem is, the article was poorly written and misleading, so what's actually going on and what can we learn from this article? I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So first of all, a disclaimer. For listeners who have already read the 8 to 15 plus different articles about this and have been following the drama closely, you may not hear any new information in this episode. My hope, as it always is with this podcast, is to put things together for the people who, haven't had the time to read the 8 to 15 plus articles. I do have some bigger picture thoughts on how this tablet article is a microcosm of a problem in the Jewish community, which is the tendency to oversimplify arguments and conversations to make them more about ideology than what's actually going on. So if you're interested, stick around for that. But before we get to the tablet article, we have to understand some background. Namely, why are people fighting about a history curriculum in California and what is so important about it? So let's rewind to 2016. California passes a law that says the state will develop a model curriculum in ethnic studies for high schools. This curriculum will take the next 5 years to get drafted, redrafted, worked through, and then approved by March 31st, 2021. Why ethnic studies? Well, there's a whole lot of academic, jargony definitions of ethnic studies, but I think the best way to understand what it is and why it's being implemented is really the historical record. Ethnic studies grew out of college student protests in the 1960s, primarily in California by Black, Latin and Mexican American, Asian American, and Native American students. Because of these protests, universities then started programs for African American studies, Asian American studies, and tracks of studies focused on other minority groups as well. This was about bringing the voice of groups typically marginalized in Western and American academia to the study of history and other disciplines. Because of that approach, in recent years there have been a lot of advocates for developing ethnic studies programs for high schools to address representation issues and, frankly, just the poor teaching of history in this country. And anecdotally, that representation really makes a difference. There are a lot of accounts of minority students feeling more engaged in school overall when they see themselves in the curriculum that they're learning. In terms of hard data, there's a small study, so, grain of salt, that was run in San Francisco where researchers compared students who were not enrolled in ethnic studies courses to students that were enrolled from 2010 to 2014. A little over 1,400 students were tracked across 3 high schools with a pre-existing ethnic studies program, and the results showed that students who took ethnic studies had an increase in their attendance and GPA compared to students that didn't. And that's not only for the ethnic studies courses, but for other classes too. So across the board, students did better when they were taking an ethnic studies course. So all of this came together in this 2016 California bill that said, hey, let's make an ethnic studies curriculum for the state and encourage more school districts to adopt some kind of ethnic studies course for high schools. Another key detail here is that ethnic studies is not mandatory in high schools. There's another California bill that has not been passed yet that would make ethnic studies mandatory for graduation, but for now that's just not the case. And even if it was, the California state curriculum being developed right now is not mandatory. So schools can choose any other ethnic studies program they want, which is something I'll come back to in a bit. But on the whole, this sounds great, right? Some real education for high schoolers based on the unique experience of the minority groups that make up California and this country. So, cool. And because California is so important politically and demographically in the US, what gets adopted there is likely to make its way in some form across the country. But as the first draft of the curriculum came out in 2019, problem emerged. It was kind of bad. There are a long list of reasons why the first draft rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. I'm just going to cover some of them. First of all, the overwhelming amount of progressive academic jargon. Here's a quote from the introduction of the original draft of the curriculum. Quote, "Ethnic studies is about people whose cultures, Herstories, it's HXR stories, so histories but herstories but with an X in there, and social positionalities are forever changing and evolving. Thus, ethnic studies also examines borders, borderlands, mixtures, hybridities, nepantlas, double consciousness, and reconfigured articulations, even within and beyond the various names and categories associated with our identities." End quote. Regardless of your politics, a model state curriculum that is meant to be a guiding document should never be that confusing and filled with jargon. There are high school teachers who have probably never studied ethnic studies so deeply so as to know those terms and who are already overworked and underpaid, and then they have this thrown at them. So that's just not great. But this kind of ultra-progressive language also came with no definition of anti-Semitism in the glossary of terms, and really no significant mention of Jewish, Hindu, Armenian, Sikh, or Greek Americans. There was, however, a sizable definition of the Palestinian boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel in the draft's glossary, and Israel is only mentioned in relation to, for example, the 1948 Palestine War, aka the Israeli War of Independence, BDS, or when saying Israel-Palestine, that's hyphenated together to denote the region. For many Jews, it's not exactly great to see Israel and the historical context for the Jewish state, which is important to many of us, get erased like that. In a letter from the California Legislative Jewish Caucus pointing out a lot of these issues, is this curious line from the legislators about the lack of reference to Jews. Quote, "We have been advised that this exclusion appeared to be intentional and reflected the political bias of the drafters." End quote. And I do have to say, just personally, as a Russian-speaking Jew looking at this first draft, this kind of progressivism is deeply uncomfortable because it's much of the same sort of inspired language and ideology that was used in the Soviet Union to push government anti-Semitism against Jews and Israel. So no thanks for the intentional exclusion of the Jews. And don't forget, if California adopted a curriculum like that, it would trickle down to schools across the state and also find its way to other states in some way, shape, or form. But then, Jewish organizations stepped in, ranging from the Jewish Community Relations Council of San Francisco to Jimena, a Mizrahi and Sephardic Jewish advocacy organization, and campus Israel advocacy organizations like Stand With Us. And over the course of the redrafting of California's ethnic studies curriculum, the latest draft, the actually third draft from December 2020, now has 2 sample lessons on American Jews, one about Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews, and another about Jewish Americans, anti-Semitism, and the complicating ideas of race. And now there are not 1, but 2 definitions of anti-Semitism included, one from the Anti-Defamation League and one from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. References to BDS have been taken out. So many of the Jewish organizations involved in changing the curriculum draft are pretty satisfied. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Is it a lot better now in their eyes? Definitely. Which brings us to this Tablet magazine article published at the end of January this year titled "California is Cleansing Jews from History." So you can already tell what the angle is here. A link to the piece, by the way, is in the podcast notes. I'm not going to go over the whole article. There's a lot in there, some of which is actually interesting and well reported. But on the whole, there are some serious problems. The article spends much of its time rehashing the failures of the first draft of the ethnic studies curriculum. And when it does finally get to talking about the most recent third draft, there's largely no engagement with, no quotes from, no recognition of the many Jewish organizations and professionals who worked to change the curriculum. There's also some misrepresentation. The tablet article portrayed the sample lesson on Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews as, quote, crude, prompting the executive director of Jimena, the organization that put together that lesson, to publish an op-ed in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency saying there was nothing wrong with it. That op-ed is linked in the podcast notes. And look, if you want to do a reported op-ed and call something crude, fine, but maybe talk to the people whose work you're calling crude and engage with them, because that at least gives some real context to readers as opposed to, look at me, I'm a journalist who has an opinion. Jimena was not quoted in the tablet piece about the lesson plan that they added. You also have this tablet piece saying that the third draft of the curriculum has a resource attached to it. It's an article that includes some hefty anti-Semitic language that I'm not going to repeat here. But after some digging around by David Schraub, a law professor who also blogs about Jewish news, it ends up that Tablet's anti-Semitic quote is from a piece published in the same volume as the actual article that was used as a reference in the draft curriculum. Schraub wrote on his blog that the anti-Semitic piece is something like 30 pages away from the article actually referenced. I mean, look, that's quite a stretch to paint this third draft of the curriculum anti-Semitic off of that. That's a bit far. And by the way, the two blog posts by Schraub about all of this are also linked in the podcast notes. But to readers who didn't go out of their way to fact-check the piece or didn't run into the fact-checking later, a piece like this just serves to panic people. And what's amazing is, even after all of this, all of the criticism that's been dug up, Tablet and the author are still standing by and defending this piece. But things get a little stranger, and this is where we cross the line from talking about the ethnic studies draft curriculum itself to the kind of ideology-driven arguing that pops up all the time in the Jewish world, and I think makes us dumber as a result. And we can all do a better job of identifying that sort of thing. So after all the criticism and pushback, the author of this tablet piece wrote a follow-up note placed right at the end of the piece. In it, she says that it doesn't actually matter what work Jewish organizations do on this curriculum, because what they're fixing is a surface-level problem. The real problem, the author alleges, is that this curriculum has been written and redrafted around not just ethnic studies, but with the guiding principle of something called critical race theory, which is apparently the real threat to Jews. Here's an excerpt. Quote, "The critical race theory framework is what is dangerous, and as I tried to show with my reporting, it is fundamental to every single draft that's so far been produced." End quote. And look, I read the tablet piece, and I have no idea what critical race theory is. There's a vague sort of definition in the piece, a quote from some writing by a scholar that says CRT, quote, "challenges the traditional claims of the educational system such as objectivity, meritocracy, colorblindness, race neutrality, and equal opportunity," end quote. Which all sounds like a great bunch of buzzwords, but that tells the reader nothing. Then the author quotes some general phrase about CRT being part of the global anti-colonialist movement and anti-racist spirit, but links to a page about critical ethnic studies, not critical race theory. And I'm definitely not an academic, but I'm pretty sure you can't just mash together jargon like that and assume it's all the same. And still, I don't know what critical race theory is after reading this piece, and now I'm extra stupid because I don't know what critical ethnic studies is either. So you've got this piece, ostensibly about saying X thing is totally bad for the Jews, and there's no clear definition of it, and there are no quotes from academics explaining this stuff, quotes like directly in interviews with them. Basically, there's no meaningful context to X thing outside of the opinion that it is bad. Now, for some people, the only context they need is that there's this thing called critical race theory. It appears to be the source of anti-Jewish drafting of this curriculum. So therefore, because there's anti-Semitism related to the thing, CRT must be bad, and voila, critical race theory is inherently anti-Semitic. But that's stupid. I really do need to be blunt. That's dumb. It's a problem. At some point, we do have to have a real discussion about real things, rather than this kind of, blanket ideological approach. And look, critical race theory may be super anti-Semitic and bad for the Jews. I just think we need to actually learn about something before we jump all over it. And I can tell you, this tablet piece didn't inform me about critical race theory in any substantial way, and definitely didn't do so in a way that would lead me to go, oh yes, I am informed enough to say it is super anti-Semitic and very bad. I mean, come on, are all things that have had anti-Semitism related to them totally bad for the Jews? Not necessarily. Do the listeners like you like Disney movies? Ford cars? Dostoevsky's books about death and tragedy? I mean, come on. Obviously, the immediate responsibility in this case is on the author and on Tablet for publishing essentially an opinion piece under the label of news. But this sort of ideology-first approach to information happens all the time. This piece could have been a real opportunity to engage with, say, scholars of critical race theory, none of whom seem to have been interviewed for this piece, or to ask Jewish organizations who have taken the ethnic studies curriculum seriously why they're involved at all if critical race theory is the worst thing in the world. You can be ideological and still engage in a way that discusses real context for readers. Or you can publish an op-ed, which, fine, but I'm not kidding. Tablet put this piece under the news heading and not under opinion, so I had no idea that this was actually meant to be some kind of opinion piece. So what are readers supposed to make of it? Contrast that approach to something like Jewish Currents, which is the progressive, lefty, used to be communist, but now is just socialist Jewish magazine. They have a very clear ideology. It's not something I agree with a lot of the time, and yet they've done some really interesting reporting on the California Ethnic Studies curriculum. Their most recent piece about it is in the podcast notes. In it, the author offers not just ideological criticism of the current draft of the curriculum from the left, the author actually sources that criticism. There are links to stories about activists and scholars disagreeing with whatever pro-Israel framing was brought to the curriculum. That's still ideology, but it's reported out and references relevant people rather than stating something as an opinion. And maybe the most interesting part of that piece is about the Mizrahi and Sephardic Jewish lesson plan added to the curriculum, the same one the tablet piece called Crude. As part of that lesson plan, there are resources attached, different, news articles, documents, that sort of thing. And two of the resources are by a history professor at the University of Washington. And the author of this Jewish Currents article reached out and actually interviewed the professor about his thoughts on the Mizrahi and Sephardic lesson plan. And the professor said he couldn't endorse the lesson plan that his writings were attached to because he saw it as doing a bad job of bringing Jews into ethnic studies. Agree or disagree with that ideological perspective, but that's an actual relevant source of authoritative opinion being quoted and providing larger context for a reader. So thus ends my sort of long tirade about we all need to do a better job of paying attention to what we consume and how things are written and framed in a way that may be trying to mislead us. Now, to get back to some final, what you should know thoughts on the California Ethnic Studies curriculum, the original drafters, so the group of academics that made the first problematic draft of the curriculum, have officially disavowed the recent changed version. Instead, they're pushing schools to adopt the first draft, and some schools have adopted resolutions in support of that first draft. That's not the end-all be-all of this. Schools can pass a resolution and then adopt something different if they want to. But the point is, because there's still choice involved, the problematic draft is still in some ways in play. There's also still all manner of criticism about the ethnic studies curriculum. Arab Americans are saying that the newest draft removes or neuters lessons about their community. Palestinian Americans are not happy about references to BDS being removed and the adoption of more pro-Israel language, as well as there being no more reference to Palestine as a place. There are obviously Jews who think the curriculum still doesn't teach well enough about the Jewish community, and there's broader criticism accusing ethnic studies and, I guess, critical race theory of being neo-Marxist. So this curriculum is a little unloved by everyone. And the deadline to fix it all up is March 31st. So I guess we'll see by then what comes out of the pipe. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.